It was the summer of 1968, and inside Abbey Road Studios, the summer of love was officially dead. The Beatles were the most famous four men on the planet, but behind closed doors, they were barely speaking. The recording sessions for the White Album weren't a creative collaboration, they were a war of attrition, and the target was the drummer. Before we dive into the wreckage of the Beatles' breakup, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring these hidden rock and roll stories to light. Now let's go back to August 22nd. The band was working on Back in the U.S.S.R, and the atmosphere was toxic. Paul McCartney, driven by a manic perfectionism, was picking apart every beat Ringo played. It's too loose, it's dragging, do it again. Ringo, usually the rock-solid heartbeat of the group, felt his confidence crumbling. He looked at John, Paul, and George and didn't see his brothers anymore. He saw three geniuses who didn't need him. He later admitted, "I felt I wasn't playing great, and I felt unloved." That afternoon, Ringo didn't throw a tantrum. He simply stood up from his kit, looked at the others, and delivered the fatal line, "I'm leaving the group." He walked out of Abbey Road, collected his family, and flew to Sardinia to escape the pressure. But the most chilling part of the story isn't that he left, it's what the band did next. They didn't chase him, they didn't cancel the session. Paul McCartney simply walked over to the empty drum stool, sat down, and recorded the drum track himself. The Beatles continued, without a Beatle. To the millions of fans buying their records, the Fab Four was an unbreakable monolith, a single soul with four heads. But inside the studio, that image was nothing more than a carefully curated lie. By the time the cameras turned off, Ringo Starr had effectively become a ghost in his own band. The reality of the White Album sessions was a crushing exercise in boredom and neglect. Ringo wasn't being treated as the rhythmic backbone of the group. He was treated like a session musician on a retainer. He would arrive at Abbey Road, ready to work, only to be relegated to the reception area. For hours he would sit there, staring at the walls or playing cards with the roadies, while the others obsessed over faders, loops, and their own solo experiments in separate rooms. The silence between takes was deafening. Ringo later confessed to the agonizing realization that he had become a spare part, a piece of furniture that the others simply walked around. The tragedy was in his perspective. He looked at John, Paul, and George and saw a tight-knit trio of geniuses, convinced that he was the sole outsider. He believed they were locked in a psychic bond he couldn't access, unaware that they were just as estranged from each other. He didn't know the unit was broken. He just knew he was the only one bleeding. This wasn't just a bad week at work. It was a systematic erasure that left the most grounded member of the Beatles drowning in isolation. That passive erasure quickly mutated into active hostility. The silence broke, and the tension finally detonated during the tracking of Back in the U.S.S.R. Paul McCartney wasn't just stepping up as a leader. He was seizing absolute control, blurring the line between bandmate and dictator. He began directing every instrument, but when he turned his gaze toward the drum kit, the dynamic turned ugly. In the past, the Beatles had screamed at each other that they had always respected the sanctity of each other's instruments. You didn't tell George how to bend a string, and you didn't tell Ringo how to hold a beat. Paul shattered that unwritten rule. He zeroed in on Ringo with a relentless, microscopic focus. Paul wasn't just asking for a different feel, he was instructing a legend on the mechanics of his own instrument. He began dictating exactly where the stick should land on the snare, and precisely how the hi-hat should be struck. It was a staggering display of hubris. Ringo Starr wasn't a novice in a garage band, he was the engine of the Beatles. He didn't need drum mussins, least of all from the bassist. But Paul wouldn't stop. The feedback wasn't constructive, it was surgical and humiliating. With every correction, Paul was essentially telling Ringo that his instincts, the very swing that had conquered the world, were wrong. It wasn't just advice anymore, it was a personal insult, a public undressing of Ringo's competence that cut deeper than any silence ever could. The air in Studio 2 became unbreathable, charged with a specific kind of venom that dissolves friendships. If you are enjoying this breakdown of rock history's most pivotal moments, please hit the like button. It's free, it really helps the channel grow, and it ensures we can keep bringing you these stories. Oh, and by the way, I will be posting more videos like this, so please subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another deep dive from me. Paul's critique had stripped away the last layer of Ringo's armor. This was the breaking point, where professional frustration turned into personal devastation, setting the stage for a rebellion no one saw coming. On August 22, 1968, Ringo Starr didn't just walk out of the studio, he walked out of the life. There was no press conference and no screaming match, just a quiet, devastating exit. He gathered his family and fled the country, desperate to put as many miles as possible between himself and the toxic atmosphere of Abbey Road. He landed in Sardinia, seeking refuge on a yacht loaned to him by his friend, the actor Peter Sellers. The Mediterranean silence was a jarring contrast to the claustrophobia of the recording booth. For the first time in years, the air didn't feel thick with judgment. But the true turning point came during a simple lunch on the deck. The yacht's captain served the drummer a plate of octopus. Ringo, a man of simple culinary tastes and a sensitive stomach, recoiled, refusing to eat the rubbery creature. But the captain didn't just clear the table. He told Ringo a story. He explained that octopuses are unparalleled introverts. They scour the ocean floor for shiny stones, tin cans, and colored glass, dragging them back to their caves to build a perimeter. They build gardens to hide in, creating a sanctuary where the predators of the deep can't reach them. The image struck Ringo with the force of a revelation. He grabbed a guitar, not to play a complex rock anthem, but to strum a simple, country-tinged melody. He wrote Octopus's Garden right there on the boat. It wasn't just a children's song, it was a desperate plea for safety. He realized that the octopus had figured out what he hadn't, how to build a wall against the chaos and find peace in the shade. Out on the water, Ringo Starr discovered he could be happy without the Beatles. He was finally safe, and he was ready to let the band sink without him. Back in London, the bravado was evaporating. The remaining Beatles tried to carry on, but the studio felt like a machine missing a gear. Paul McCartney sat behind the drum kit to record Back in the U.S.S.R., determined to prove the band was bigger than any one member. But when they played the playback, the truth was undeniable. The drumming was technically perfect, yet completely soulless. It was stiff, it was robotic. It sounded like the Beatles, but it didn't swing like them. Panic set in. They realized that Ringo wasn't just a drummer. He was the heartbeat that kept their ego-driven chaos in rhythm. Desperate, they fired off a telegram to Sardinia. It didn't contain legal threats or contract disputes. Instead, it carried a plea that Ringo had waited a lifetime to hear. You are the best rock and roll drummer in the world. Come on home. We love you. On September 5th, Ringo walked back into Abbey Road, bracing himself for the same cold shoulders he had left behind. He stopped dead in his tracks. His drum kit was invisible, buried under a mountain of flowers. Blue, white, and red blooms spilled over the snare and cymbals, arranged by George Harrison to spell out "Welcome Home." For a moment, the tension broke. Ringo sat behind the kit, surrounded by pedals, feeling genuinely loved for the first time in years. But as they launched into the next take, the tragedy remained. The flowers were a beautiful gesture, yet they were only camouflage. The resentment, the power struggles, and the silence were still there, just hidden beneath a layer of colorful deceit. The band was back together, but the rot had already set in. By March 1970, the silence between them wasn't just awkward, it was weaponized. The Beatles were technically still a band, but they were operating like warring nation-states. Paul McCartney was isolated at his Cavendish Avenue home, furiously recording his solo debut, McCartney. He was desperate to prove he could survive on his own. But the others, John, George, and their new Bulldog manager, Alan Klein, had a different plan. They wanted Paul to step aside. They needed to clear the schedule for the release of Let It Be, the band's final, beleaguered album. They drafted a letter. It was a sterile, business-like demand. Don't release your album yet. Wait for us. But they didn't send a lawyer to deliver it. They sent Ringo. It was a calculated move. Ringo Starr was the Switzerland of the Beatles, the neutral ground, the one brother everyone still loved. They assumed that even in his darkest mood, Paul wouldn't shoot the messenger if the messenger was Ringo. They were wrong. When Ringo arrived at the heavy gates of Cavendish Avenue, the air was already thick with paranoia. Paul opened the door, and for a moment it was just two friends standing on a threshold. Then Ringo handed over the letter. As Paul read the demand to push back his solo work, his declaration of independence, something inside him snapped. The years of biting his tongue, the resentment over Klein, the grief of losing John to Yoko, it all detonated at once. Paul didn't just get angry, he exploded. His face contorted in a way Ringo had never seen. "I'll finish you now," Paul screamed, jabbing his finger inches from Ringo's nose. "You'll pay." The words echoed through the hallway, shattering the last polite fiction of their brotherhood. This wasn't a band argument, it was a physical threat. Paul grabbed Ringo by his coat and physically shoved him out the door, slamming it shut with a finality that rang in Ringo's ears long after he walked away. Ringo stood on the pavement, trembling. He had come expecting a negotiation. He left having stared into the face of a stranger. He returned to the others, shaken and pale, delivering a new message. Leave him alone. He's gone completely crazy. The letter had been delivered, but the cost was absolute. The brotherhood didn't end in a courtroom or a press release. It ended on a doorstep in London, with a shout and a slam. That slam didn't just close a door, it opened a war. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the deep breath before a scream. Within months, the brotherhood moved from the studio to the High Court. On New Year's Eve 1970, Paul McCartney did the unthinkable. He sued the others. It was a nuclear option. The court documents didn't list a band. They listed Paul McCartney versus John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. The peacemaker, Ringo, was now a defendant. The press painted it as a simple breakup, but behind closed doors, it was a bitter, exhausting siege. For 3 long years, the only way they spoke was through lawyers, who charged by the hour to dismantle their shared history. Paul and Ringo, once the rhythm section that held the world together, were effectively strangers. The warmth was replaced by icy affidavits. To the world, they were just drifting apart, but in truth, they were actively tearing each other down to survive. But anger has a shelf life. Brotherhood does not. The thaw was slow, agonizing, and quiet. It didn't happen in a courtroom, but in the realization that no one else on earth could possibly understand their life. As the years passed, the sharp edges of the 1970s dulled. They realized they were the only 2 people left who remembered the smell of the van in Liverpool. Today, the lawsuits are footnotes, forgotten by everyone but historians. The 2 men who once stood on opposite sides of a courtroom are now the last 2 standing, bound by a love that survived the very thing that tried to kill it. They came perilously close to hating each other forever, only to find that in the end, they were all they had left.